What if the greatest crusade launched since the age of the Emperor did not fail because it was defeated, but because it was slowly crushed under its own impossible weight, until victory itself became another liability dragging it toward collapse? The Indomitus Crusade is remembered in Imperial proclamations as a triumphant surge of reclamation, a blaze of hope cutting through the darkness left by the Great Rift. Yet this official memory conceals a far more unsettling reality. From its earliest middle years, the Crusade was already fracturing, already bending under pressures no amount of faith, discipline, or strategic genius could fully contain, and it is within this hidden tension that the true meaning of the title, Why the Crusade, almost collapsed, reveals itself. Guilliman's armadas had indeed liberated hundreds of systems, driven back chaos incursions, shattered Xenos enclaves, and restored Imperial authority to worlds that had known only isolation and terror. But each of these victories carried a cost that compounded rather than diminished over time. Fleets surged forward faster than they could be supplied. Forge worlds were stripped to feed distant war zones, and the vast bureaucratic arteries of the Imperium strained to keep pace with a war that spanned light years faster than orders could be written, approved, and delivered. The Crusade's initial momentum created the illusion of inevitability, yet beneath that surface lay a creeping logistical exhaustion, a slow hemorrhaging of ships, material, manpower, and morale that no battle report could fully capture. Battle groups found themselves holding liberated systems with insufficient forces, forced to choose between pressing forward or consolidating gains, knowing that either choice invited disaster somewhere else. Every step deeper into the fractured galaxy widened the gap between Guilliman's strategic vision and the Imperium's ability to sustain it, and this gap became the silent enemy gnawing at the Crusade from within. As years passed, the Indomitus Crusade ceased to resemble a unified hammer blow and instead became a sprawling, overextended organism, its limbs flailing across multiple fronts while its core struggled to remain coherent. The Great Rift did not merely divide the Imperium geographically. It distorted time, communication, and coordination to such a degree that fleets often fought wars without knowing whether neighboring sectors still existed. Reinforcements arrived decades too late or not at all. Astropathic messages degraded into half-mad fragments, and commanders were forced to make irreversible decisions in near-total informational darkness. The Crusade structure, vast beyond anything attempted since the Great Crusade itself, proved too large for the Imperium's decayed systems to support. Even Guilliman, a Primaris forged for governance and logistics, began to recognize a grim truth. The Imperium he had inherited was not the Imperium his father had built, and it could not sustain a campaign of this magnitude without tearing itself apart. This realization did not arrive as a single moment of despair, but as a suffocating accumulation of reports. Supply convoys vanishing into warp storms, newly liberated worlds immediately besieged by resurgent chaos cults, orc empires swelling faster than they could be culled, and Xenos powers exploiting every Imperial advance to carve out new domains in the chaos left behind. Victory no longer simplified the war, it multiplied it. The psychological weight of this transformation cannot be overstated, for the Indomitus Crusade was not merely a military endeavor but a symbol, a declaration that the Imperium still possessed the will and strength to impose order upon a broken galaxy. As that symbol began to crack, so too did the fragile hope bound to it. Soldiers who had marched under banners of renewal found themselves trapped in endless cycles of redeployment, watching worlds they had bled for fall back into darkness the moment Imperial fleets moved on. Populations once freed began to resent the crusade that had stripped their resources, conscripted their youth, and left them exposed to retaliation. The Imperium's own citizens became reluctant participants in a war that promised salvation but delivered perpetual sacrifice. Here, the Crusade's near collapse takes on its most disturbing form, not as a sudden defeat, but as a grinding erosion of belief, a slow realization spreading through ranks and worlds alike that the Crusade might not be able to finish what it had begun. Guilliman's command style, precise and relentless, further exposed the strain. He understood that hesitation meant annihilation, yet decisiveness carried its own costs when every order reverberated across sectors already on the brink. Concentrating forces invited catastrophic losses elsewhere. Dispersing them diluted the Crusade's strength to the point of ineffectiveness. The Imperium's enemies sensed this imbalance and adapted, striking supply lines, igniting uprisings in rearward systems, and forcing Imperial forces to fight not as conquerors, but as desperate custodians of territory they could barely hold. Even rumors of Guilliman's approach became weapons, quelling rebellions in some regions while provoking preemptive strikes in others, adding yet another layer of unpredictability to an already unmanageable war. The Indomitus Crusade, once envisioned as a spear thrust into the heart of darkness, now resembled a vast defensive net stretched too thin, its every strand trembling under constant assault. It is within this context that the title's claim must be understood. The Crusade almost collapsed not because Guilliman lacked vision, nor because the Imperium lacked courage, but because the scale of the endeavor collided with the brutal reality of a galaxy that no longer obeyed Imperial logic. The Imperium's institutions, its fleets, its supply bureaus, its chains of command, were relics struggling to function in an age defined by warp-torn physics and endless attrition. Each success demanded resources the Imperium could no longer easily replace, and each setback rippled outward, compounding existing weaknesses. Guilliman was attempting to rebuild an empire while it was still burning, and the Indomitus Crusade became the embodiment of that contradiction. An act of supreme resolve carried out atop a foundation already crumbling beneath its own history. The closer the Crusade came to its objectives, the more apparent it became that achieving them might shatter what little cohesion the Imperium had left. And so, as this chapter closes, the question that haunts every subsequent decision emerges with quiet, inescapable force. If the Indomitus Crusade was already straining toward collapse while still fighting within the Imperium's reach, what unimaginable cost would be demanded when Guilliman finally pushed his exhausted armadas beyond the last fragile lines of support and into the abyss of the Dark Imperium itself? Chapter 2: The Wolf's Price. Political Fractures in a Dying Empire. What does it reveal about the state of an empire when its greatest crusade cannot advance without bargaining, mistrust, and quiet threats between those who are supposed to be brothers in the same war? As the Indomitus Crusade pushed deeper into contested space and the illusion of effortless momentum finally shattered, Guilliman was forced to confront a truth more destabilizing than any Xenos invasion or chaos uprising. The Imperium he sought to save no longer moved as a single body, but as a collection of fractured powers bound together by necessity rather than unity. The Crusade's near collapse did not stem solely from overextended fleets or failing supply lines. It was accelerated by internal resistance, by old grudges preserved like sacred relics, and by chapters and institutions that viewed Guilliman not as a savior, but as an unsettling reminder of an age that had judged them and moved on. Nowhere was this fracture more visible than on Fenris, where Guilliman sought the aid of the Space Wolves, not out of strategic convenience, but out of desperation. Terra itself lay under growing threat from Orc incursions, and Guilliman understood that without a powerful force anchoring the throne world's defense, the Crusade risked catastrophic reversal. Yet to ask for aid from the wolves was to reopen wounds carved deep during the Primarch's absence, wounds shaped by suspicion of authority, resentment of reform, and a long memory of Imperial overreach. The Space Wolves represented something Guilliman could not command through doctrine or decree: fiercely independent power. Their distrust of centralized control, their skepticism toward Primaris reinforcements, and their cultural resistance to Call's innovations made them both invaluable and unpredictable. Guilliman's approach to Fenris was therefore not a triumphant reunion, but a calculated negotiation conducted under the shadow of mutual unease. The Crusade needed the Wolves' strength, yet the Wolves demanded guarantees, reinforcements, autonomy, and respect for their traditions, in exchange for their loyalty. This exchange exposed a deeper rot within the Imperium. Even at the height of a galaxy-spanning emergency, cooperation had become conditional. Unity was no longer assumed. It had to be purchased. The Indomitus Crusade, envisioned as a symbol of restored Imperial authority, instead revealed how thin that authority had become. Guilliman could no longer simply command obedience. He had to navigate a labyrinth of political sensitivities, appeasing factions whose cooperation was vital yet never assured. Wave-like dread grows when one recognizes what this negotiation truly signified. Guilliman was not merely securing allies. He was redistributing the burden of survival across an empire already cracking under strain. By leaving the defense of Terra to the Space Wolves, he implicitly acknowledged that the Crusade could not protect everything at once. This was not strategy born of strength, but triage born of scarcity. Each such decision narrowed the margin for error, turning the Crusade into a delicate balancing act where the failure of a single agreement could unravel entire sectors. The Imperium's enemies sensed this fragility, exploiting delays and internal friction to press their advantage. Orc warbands multiplied. Chaos cults re-emerged in supposedly secured systems, and rumors of Imperial weakness spread faster than any fleet could suppress them. The political fractures exposed on Fenris were not isolated incidents. They were symptoms of a wider systemic failure in which trust had eroded alongside infrastructure. The psychological impact of these internal negotiations rippled through the Crusade's ranks. Commanders accustomed to absolute authority now found themselves constrained by political compromise. Astartes' chapters questioned the legitimacy of new doctrines imposed by a resurrected Primarch whose vision clashed with centuries of adaptation. The presence of Primaris reinforcements, intended as a unifying force, instead deepened suspicion in some quarters, as ancient warriors viewed them as symbols of unwanted change rather than salvation. This distrust did not erupt into open conflict, but it festered, creating an undercurrent of hesitation and second-guessing that slowed decision-making at critical moments. In a war defined by speed and overwhelming force, such hesitation proved lethal. The Indomitus Crusade did not stall because its armies lacked courage. It stalled because its leaders could no longer assume shared purpose. As Guilliman pressed onward, leaving Fenris behind, the implications of this compromise followed him like a shadow. The Crusade's cohesion depended increasingly on personal agreements rather than institutional stability. Each alliance carried conditions. Each promise demanded future concessions. The Imperium's unity was no longer forged by shared belief in a singular destiny, but by overlapping fears of annihilation. This fragile network of obligations held, for a time, but it strained under the weight of constant warfare. The more Guilliman relied on negotiation, the more apparent it became that the Imperium's political spine had weakened, unable to support the scale of the crusade without splintering. Victory, once defined by conquest, now required constant diplomatic maintenance, draining time, focus, and resources from an already overstretched war effort. In this light, the near collapse of the Indomitus Crusade appears not as a sudden crisis, but as an inevitable outcome of an empire trying to function without cohesion. The wolf's price was not merely Primaris reinforcements or strategic concessions. It was a warning. A warning that the Imperium's survival now depended on fragile truces between powers that no longer trusted one another, and that the Crusade's forward momentum masked a growing vulnerability at its core. Guilliman could still marshal fleets and armies, but he could not restore the faith that once bound them into a singular, unstoppable force. And as the Crusade pushed toward even darker regions of the galaxy, this absence of trust became its most dangerous liability. The chapter closes on an unsettling realization that sharpens the dread for what follows. If the Indomitus Crusade could only continue by bargaining with its own defenders, then what would happen when Guilliman was forced to rely on forces far less loyal, far less human, and far more alien as the war dragged him ever closer to the heart of the Dark Imperium? Chapter 3: Awakening the Forgotten Legions. What happens to an already fragile crusade when its greatest reinforcements do not come from the present, but from a buried past that the Imperium barely remembers and no longer understands? As the Indomitus Crusade staggered forward under the weight of its own expansion, Guilliman and Belisarius Cawl turned to a solution that appeared on the surface to promise salvation: the release of vast reserves of Primaris Space Marines, warriors forged long before the Great Rift, some of whom had slept in stasis since the age when the Emperor still walked among men. These were not merely reinforcements. They were relics of a lost epoch, awakened into a galaxy unrecognizable even to a Primarch. Their emergence was intended to stabilize the Crusade, to replenish depleted battle groups and anchor newly liberated systems. Yet this act introduced a new and deeply unsettling variable into an already unstable equation. Many of these warriors carried memories stretching back to the Great Crusade itself, recollections of fighting alongside legends whose names had become scripture, and their sudden awakening created a collision between eras that reverberated across the Imperium. They did not arrive as blank slates. They arrived as ghosts of a more confident age, bearing expectations the modern Imperium could no longer fulfill. At first, their deployment appeared miraculous. Battlefronts on the brink of collapse stabilized. Chapters long reduced to skeletal strength found themselves reinforced beyond imagination. Entire sectors rallied at the sight of towering Primaris warriors clad in heraldry older than some worlds' histories. Yet beneath this surge of renewed strength lay a deeper tension that Guilliman could not ignore. The Imperium into which these warriors awakened was not the rational, unified empire they remembered, but a fractured theocracy ruled by superstition, fear, and endless bureaucracy. Their reverence for the Emperor clashed with the cultic excesses that now defined Imperial faith. Their understanding of command conflicted with millennia of doctrinal drift, and their very existence, engineered, perfected, and unleashed by Cawl, raised questions no one wished to answer openly. Were these warriors the continuation of the Emperor's vision? Or were they the product of a single Mughos hubris, imposed upon the Imperium without its consent? Wave-like dread builds as these ancient Primaris are integrated into modern chapters such as the Crimson Fists and the Blood Angels. Forces shaped by centuries of trauma, loss, and adaptation. The meeting of old and new did not produce seamless unity. It produced friction. Veterans hardened by unending war found themselves fighting alongside warriors who remembered a time when hope was not considered heretical. Ancient Primaris struggled to reconcile their memories of brotherhood with chapters now defined by ritualized grief and perpetual attrition. This tension rarely erupted into open conflict, but it manifested as hesitation, misunderstanding, and subtle resistance. Small fractures that, when multiplied across a galaxy-spanning crusade, became strategically significant. The Indomitus Crusade was not merely fighting external enemies. It was attempting to merge incompatible versions of itself into a coherent whole, and every such attempt drained time and focus it could not spare. The psychological cost of awakening these forgotten legions extended beyond the battlefield. For the Imperium citizens, the sight of warriors older than their own civilizations provoked awe mixed with dread. To some, the Primaris represented divine intervention, proof that the Emperor had never truly abandoned humanity. To others, they were a reminder of everything that had been lost. A painful contrast between the Imperium's decayed present and a past it could no longer reclaim. This emotional dissonance spread through liberated systems, undermining the Crusade's message of renewal. Instead of reinforcing faith, the Primaris sometimes highlighted the Imperium's decline, turning hope into resentment and reverence into unease. Worlds asked unspoken questions. If such warriors had always existed, why had they not come sooner? If salvation had been hidden for millennia, what else was being withheld? At the heart of this turmoil stood Belisarius Cawl, whose role in awakening and deploying these forces further destabilized the Crusade's internal balance. His Zarquesitor churned out Primaris at a scale that strained supply networks already on the verge of collapse. Gene seed stock predating entire chapters was allocated according to Call's calculations rather than traditional hierarchies, bypassing centuries of established protocol. To Guilliman, this was a necessary risk. To many within the Adeptus Mechanicus and the Astartes, it was an alarming consolidation of power in the hands of a single being whose loyalties remained opaque. The Crusade's dependence on Cawl deepened, binding its survival ever more tightly to technologies and decisions few fully understood. Each Primaris warrior deployed represented not just a reinforcement, but another thread tying the Imperium's fate to Call's unseen designs. The wave descends into suffocating reflection as Guilliman begins to recognize the paradox at the heart of this strategy. The Primaris were meant to stabilize the Crusade, yet their presence magnified its underlying contradictions. They embodied progress in an empire built on stagnation. They carried the Emperor's legacy into an age that worshipped him as a god rather than followed him as a ruler. They reinforced armies while simultaneously exposing how desperate the Imperium had become. The Crusade's near collapse was delayed, not resolved, by their arrival. Victory continued to demand more warriors, more resources, more concessions to innovation, while the structures meant to support such growth remained brittle and overextended. The Imperium was saving itself by methods that threatened to unravel its own identity. As deployments continued, Guilliman faced an increasingly grim realization. The Indomitus Crusade could no longer retreat from the changes it had unleashed. The awakening of the Forgotten Legions had set irreversible processes in motion, binding the Crusade's success to the acceptance of a future fundamentally different from the Imperium's past. Resistance to this future did not halt it. It merely slowed it, introducing delays and inefficiencies that the Crusade could ill afford. Each battle won by the Primaris raised expectations that could not be sustained indefinitely. Each system secured by ancient warriors demanded garrisons, governance, and supply lines that stretched the Crusade thinner still. What had begun as reinforcement now risked becoming another burden. And so the chapter closes on a quiet, unsettling question that cuts to the heart of the Crusade's fragility. If the Indomitus Crusade must rely on warriors pulled from a forgotten age to survive the present, what does that say about the Imperium's ability to endure the future? And how long can a crusade last when it is propped up by echoes of a world that no longer exists? Chapter 4: Into the Dark Imperium. A galaxy fighting itself. What happens when a crusade designed to restore order is forced to march into a realm where order itself has been erased, and every step forward transforms victory into another wound the Imperium cannot afford to heal? As the Indomitus Crusade pushed beyond its early reclamations and began to encroach upon the shattered regions bordering Imperium Nihilus, the war ceased to behave like a campaign and instead revealed itself as a systemic collapse unfolding in slow motion. Guilliman's fleets no longer advanced into clearly defined battlefronts. They entered a galaxy where the Great Rift had warped causality, communication, and loyalty itself, turning every sector into a potential trap and every liberated world into a temporary illusion of control. The further the Crusade pressed into this darkness, the more apparent it became that the Imperium was not fighting a single enemy, but a convergence of disasters feeding upon one another. Chaos did not retreat, it metastasized. Xenos did not wait their turn. They surged into every vacuum left by Imperial advance. Even human worlds, half-mad from isolation and warp exposure, resisted liberation as fiercely as invasion. In this environment, the Indomitus Crusade began to bleed coherence, its victories fragmented across a star map that refused to stabilize. The grinding horror of this phase of the Crusade is best understood not through grand battles, but through accumulation. Ultramar burned in the Plague Wars as Mortarian's corruption seeped into worlds once considered secure, forcing Guilliman to divert attention and resources back toward his own realm, even as the wider Crusade demanded constant forward momentum. Word-bearer cells ignited insurrections within the heart of Segmentum Solar itself, turning supposedly pacified systems into ideological minefields where faith became a weapon wielded against Imperial authority. Orc empires, sensing instability like predators tasting blood, erupted across multiple sectors, growing faster than they could be annihilated. Meanwhile, the Tau Fifth Sphere expansion exploited the Imperium's distraction, advancing under the cover of Imperial chaos, while other threats commanded Guilliman's attention. Beneath all of this, Vashtor's machinations threaded unseen through the conflict, a reminder that even as the Imperium fought visible wars, darker forces were shaping the technological and metaphysical terrain of the future. Each of these conflicts demanded resolution, yet resolving any one of them weakened the Imperium's ability to respond to the others. The Crusade was no longer choosing its battles. It was reacting to them. Wave-like dread builds as the sheer exhaustion of the Crusade becomes impossible to ignore. Battle groups deployed into Imperium Nihilus found themselves fighting wars without reinforcement, without reliable resupply, and often without confirmation that neighboring fleets still existed. Time dilation caused by the warp meant that victories reported by one fleet might arrive centuries too late to matter, while defeats could erase entire sectors before warnings were ever received. Guilliman's strategic mind, built for clarity and order, was forced to operate within a fog so dense that even Primarch-level foresight could not fully penetrate it. Decisions that once would have been straightforward now carried catastrophic uncertainty. Commit forces to extinguish a chaos incursion and risk leaving a flank open to Xeno's advance, or hold position and allow corruption to fester unchecked. In this environment, the Indomitus Crusade began to resemble an organism suffering systemic failure, its immune responses firing constantly but never decisively, draining its strength with every reaction. The psychological toll of this endless fragmentation rippled outward through every level of the Crusade. Commanders accustomed to defined objectives found themselves trapped in wars with no clear endpoints. Astartes chapters fought campaigns knowing that even total victory might be erased within decades by the return of the warp storm. Imperial Guard regiments were redeployed so frequently that cohesion collapsed, soldiers fighting on worlds they no longer understood for causes that no longer felt connected. Civilians, witnessing repeated cycles of liberation and abandonment, began to see the Imperium not as a savior but as a transient force that arrived, consumed resources, and departed, leaving them to face inevitable retribution alone. These perceptions eroded loyalty far more effectively than any heretical sermon, undermining the Crusade's moral authority even as its armies continued to fight. The Indomitus Crusade's promise of restoration began to ring hollow, replaced by a grim acceptance that survival itself was temporary. The deeper horror of this phase lies in the realization that the Crusade structure was fundamentally incompatible with the reality it faced. Designed as a concentrated effort to reclaim and stabilize, it instead encountered a galaxy where stability was no longer a permanent state but a fleeting anomaly. Each time Guilliman consolidated gains, the surrounding regions destabilized, forcing new deployments that stretched the Crusade thinner still. The Imperium's enemies learned to exploit this pattern, provoking responses designed not to defeat Imperial forces outright, but to exhaust them through constant engagement. Victory was redefined as endurance, and endurance became increasingly scarce. Even Guilliman's presence, once a stabilizing force, began to function as a catalyst for escalation. His arrival drew the attention of ever greater threats, transforming strategic successes into magnets for disaster. As this phase of the Crusade unfolded, it became clear that the Indomitus Crusade was no longer advancing toward a definable end state. It was circling a widening drain, pouring resources into conflicts that regenerated faster than they could be resolved. The Crusade had not yet collapsed, but it was losing its ability to dictate terms, reacting to a galaxy that had seized the initiative. Guilliman's strategic brilliance kept the structure from disintegrating outright, yet even he could not reverse the underlying trend. The Imperium was fighting a war of attrition against entropy itself. Each new front, each renewed uprising, each resurgent enemy narrowed the margin for error until a single miscalculation threatened to unravel entire sectors. And so the chapter closes with a question that sharpens the sense of impending failure. If the Indomitus Crusade is already being consumed by endless wars within reach of Imperial supply and authority, What chance does it have of survival when Guilliman is forced to abandon consolidation entirely and pushes exhausted forces deeper into a realm where the Imperium's laws, faith, and power mean almost nothing at all? Chapter 5: When Supply Lines Bleed, the Nightmare of Imperial Logistics. What use is victory when an empire cannot feed, arm, or reinforce the forces required to hold it? And every kilometer of reclaimed space only deepens the wound tearing through its own lifeblood. By the midpoint of the Indomitus Crusade, Guilliman came to understand a truth as old as warfare itself, yet magnified to apocalyptic scale. Armies do not collapse only when defeated on the battlefield. They collapse when the systems that sustain them begin to fail invisibly, far from the roar of guns. The Crusade's near collapse did not announce itself through a single catastrophic loss, but through a slow hemorrhaging of logistics that no Primarch, no matter how gifted, could fully arrest. The Officio Logistic vast beyond mortal comprehension, was tasked with supporting fleets scattered across light years of broken space, supplying wars that multiplied faster than any inventory could account for. Forge worlds were stripped to exhaustion, their output diverted endlessly forward, leaving rear sectors hollowed out and vulnerable. Convoys vanished into warp storms distorted by the Great Rift, not merely delayed but erased. Their loss often discovered months or years after the fact, when frontline commanders realized promised reinforcements would never arrive. In this way, the Crusade began to starve, not always of food or ammunition, but of certainty, predictability, and the illusion that the Imperium still controlled the mechanisms of its own survival. Wave-like dread rises as one examines how scale itself became the enemy. The Indomitus Crusade was simply too vast for the Imperium that attempted to sustain it. Routes that had functioned for millennia collapsed under warp turbulence. Astropathic relays degraded, forcing fleets to operate on outdated intelligence. Orders arrived corrupted, contradictory, or obsolete, turning strategic coordination into a gamble rather than a science. Commanders were forced to hoard supplies, knowing that redistribution could mean never being resupplied at all. Others pressed forward despite shortages, gambling on decisive victories that might justify the risk. Many lost that gamble. Entire battle groups stalled in hostile systems, immobilized not by enemy fire but by fuel shortages, reactor fatigue, or the simple absence of replacement parts that no longer existed within reachable distance. The Imperium's enemies learned this weakness quickly, striking not at armies directly, but at the arteries that fed them. Orcs ambushed convoys. Chaos forces targeted manufactoria rather than fortresses. Even human rebels understood that starving the Crusade was easier than fighting it head-on. The psychological impact of logistical collapse seeped through the Crusade like poison. Soldiers accustomed to overwhelming supply superiority found themselves rationing ammunition, repairing war gear with scavenged parts, and fighting prolonged engagements without relief. Astartes chapters, built for shock warfare, were forced into grinding defensive actions simply because they lacked the means to redeploy. Imperial Guard regiments suffered most, their casualty rates climbing as medical supplies dwindled and replacements failed to arrive. Morale eroded not from fear of death, but from the sense of abandonment, the creeping belief that the Imperium no longer knew they existed. This erosion of trust struck at the heart of the Crusade's legitimacy. An empire that cannot sustain its armies cannot claim authority over the worlds those armies defend, and populations quickly sensed this vulnerability. liberated planets resented the endless requisitions demanded to feed a crusade that offered no guarantee of protection once it moved on. Riots erupted. Governors withheld resources. Some worlds quietly prepared for the Imperium's inevitable retreat rather than commit fully to a cause that seemed increasingly unsustainable. Guilliman attempted to impose order through ruthless prioritization, triage on a galactic scale. Some fronts were reinforced at the expense of others. Some systems were deliberately abandoned, written off as acceptable losses to preserve the Crusade's core momentum. These decisions, logical as they were, accelerated the fragmentation of Imperial authority. Each abandoned world became a beacon for chaos, xenos, or rebellion, spawning new threats that demanded future intervention. The Crusade's logistics became a self-defeating cycle. Resources were consumed to reclaim territory, which then demanded further resources to hold, drawing strength away from the next advance. The Imperium was no longer expanding. It was treading water in a sea of infinite hostility, burning itself to remain afloat. The deeper horror of this phase lies in its inevitability. No amount of courage, faith, or strategic brilliance could fully overcome the structural decay of the Imperium's logistical foundations. The systems that once supported the Great Crusade had been eroded by 10,000 years of stagnation, ritualization, and bureaucratic inertia. Guilliman could streamline processes, issue reforms, and bypass dogma where possible, but every reform encountered resistance, delay, or outright sabotage. The Mechanicus guarded its forge worlds jealously. Administratum clerks drowned critical data in oceans of parchment. Each attempt to optimize revealed how brittle the Imperium had become, how dependent it was on procedures that functioned only under conditions that no longer existed. The Indomitus Crusade exposed these weaknesses mercilessly, transforming logistical strain into a weapon wielded by the galaxy itself. As the Crusade dragged on, the cumulative effect of these failures became impossible to ignore. Fleets fought with diminishing efficiency. Victory required ever greater sacrifice for ever smaller gains. Guilliman's strategic vision narrowed, not because he lacked ambition, but because the Crusade could no longer support grand maneuvers. Survival replaced conquest as the primary objective. The Crusade had not yet collapsed, but it had entered a state of critical fragility, where a single large-scale logistical failure, a lost supply nexus, a corrupted forge world, a severed warp route, could trigger a cascade of defeats no force could contain. The Imperium's greatest hope now balanced on a foundation riddled with cracks, each one widening under the relentless pressure of war. And so this chapter closes with a question that cuts deeper than any battlefield defeat. If the Indomitus Crusade is bleeding out through its own supply lines, sustained only by sacrifice and desperation, what will happen when Guilliman is forced to choose between holding what has been reclaimed and pushing onward into regions where no logistics can follow at all? Chapter 6: The Shattering, Breaking the Unnumbered Suns. What does it mean for a crusade to survive only by destroying its own unity? And can an empire truly endure when its greatest act of preservation is also an admission of irreversible failure? By the time Guilliman confronted the reality of the Indomitus Crusade's condition, the evidence was no longer subtle. The Crusade could not continue in its existing form without collapsing entirely. The vast host of the unnumbered suns, gray shields drawn from countless gene lines and forged into a single unprecedented force, had once embodied the Crusade's promise of renewal, a concentrated expression of Guilliman's belief that overwhelming strength and disciplined coordination could restore order to a broken galaxy. Yet that same concentration had become a liability. The unnumbered suns required colossal logistical support, centralized command, and constant redeployment, all of which strained an Imperium already staggering under fragmentation. Their very existence tethered the Crusade to a scale it could no longer sustain, and Guilliman, faced with the prospect of total systemic failure, made a decision that would redefine the Indomitus Crusade forever. He shattered his greatest weapon to save the war. The breaking of the unnumbered suns was not a retreat, nor was it a defeat in any traditional sense. It was a strategic amputation, a conscious sacrifice of cohesion in exchange for survival. Guilliman dispersed these warriors across the Imperium, seeding them into new chapters and reinforcing old ones, transforming a single massive force into countless smaller anchors of stability. On the surface, this decision appeared pragmatic, even inspired, for it allowed newly liberated systems to defend themselves without constant reliance on Crusade fleets. Yet beneath this logic lay an unspoken acknowledgement of failure. The Indomitus Crusade had begun as a unified effort to reclaim and stabilize, but it would continue only as a constellation of isolated struggles, each chapter standing alone against threats that once would have been faced collectively. Guilliman was not merely adapting to reality. He was conceding that the Crusade could no longer impose its will through centralized might. Wave-like dread emerges when one considers the psychological impact of this decision on those who fought within the unnumbered suns. These warriors had been forged with a singular purpose, their identities shaped around the idea of belonging to something unprecedented, a force that transcended chapter traditions and embodied Guilliman's renewed Imperium. To be broken apart, reassigned, and absorbed into disparate chapters was to lose that shared identity overnight. Some found purpose in their new roles. Others struggled to reconcile their origins with the customs and doctrines of their adopted brothers. This fragmentation introduced new tensions across the Imperium, as chapters grappled with integrating warriors whose training, mindset, and loyalty had been shaped by a different vision of unity. What had been a symbol of cohesion became a source of subtle instability, another fault line running through the already fractured structure of Imperial power. The strategic consequences of the shattering were profound. By dispersing the unnumbered suns, Guilliman reduced the immediate logistical burden on the Crusade, but he also relinquished the ability to conduct large-scale, decisive operations with overwhelming force. The Crusade's character shifted irrevocably from offensive to defensive, from conquest to containment. Newly formed chapters were tasked with holding territory, suppressing uprisings, and responding to localized threats, effectively freezing the front lines rather than pushing them forward. This bought the Imperium time, but at a terrible cost: momentum. The Indomitus Crusade no longer surged. It stalled, its progress measured not in reclaimed sectors but in disasters averted. Guilliman's genius prevented collapse, but it could not restore the Crusade's original ambition without reigniting the very pressures that had nearly destroyed it. The deeper horror of this transformation lies in what it revealed about the Imperium's limits. Guilliman, perhaps more clearly than anyone else alive, understood that the empire his father had built was no longer capable of sustaining galaxy-spanning offensives indefinitely. The shattering of the unnumbered suns was an admission that the Imperium had entered an age where survival required decentralization, where unity was no longer a strength but a vulnerability. Each new chapter seated across the stars represented a bulwark against collapse, yet also a step away from the centralized authority that once defined Imperial power. The Imperium was becoming a patchwork of fortified enclaves, rather than a coherent empire, its cohesion maintained through shared fear rather than shared purpose. As this new structure took hold, the Indomitus Crusade's narrative shifted in the minds of those who fought within it. No longer did they speak of an end to the war or a moment when the Imperium would be whole again. Instead, they spoke of holding lines, buying time, and enduring. Guilliman's presence, once a symbol of decisive leadership, now served as a stabilizing influence rather than a catalyst for expansion. He had prevented catastrophe, but at the cost of acknowledging that the Crusade's original vision was unattainable. The war would continue, but it would do so in fragments, each fighting its own battles under the shadow of a unity that no longer truly existed. The Indomitus Crusade survived this moment not because it triumphed, but because it transformed itself into something less ambitious and more resilient. Yet this transformation carried a chilling implication. If the Crusade could endure only by abandoning the dream of reconquest, then the Imperium's future would be defined not by victory, but by perpetual defense against an ever-encroaching darkness. Guilliman had saved the Crusade from immediate collapse, but he had also locked it into a state of permanent attrition, where every gain would be temporary and every loss potentially irreversible. And so this chapter closes with a question that tightens the sense of looming uncertainty. If the Indomitus Crusade can survive only by breaking itself apart, what hope remains when Guilliman is forced to lead what is left not as a unified force, but as a scattering of isolated strongholds facing a galaxy that grows more hostile with every passing year? Chapter 7: The Gate of Resolve. When survival requires the unthinkable. What line remains uncrossed when an empire's survival demands that it trust the very technologies and principles it once swore would never be touched again? By the time Guilliman turned his gaze toward the Attilan Gate, the Indomitus Crusade had reached a moment of existential reckoning, a point where collapse was no longer a distant possibility, but a constant pressure bearing down on every remaining strategic decision. The Crusade had survived fragmentation, exhaustion, and logistical hemorrhage, yet it now faced a final barrier that could not be overcome by will or manpower alone. The Imperium Nihilus loomed beyond the gate as a realm severed from Imperial law, faith, and reliable reality itself. A region where the Great Rift's distortions rendered conventional warp travel suicidal and long-term coordination nearly impossible. Guilliman understood that pushing the Crusade forward without securing a stable passage would not merely risk defeat, it would guarantee annihilation. The Attilan Gate thus became more than a route of advance. It became the fulcrum upon which the Crusade's survival balanced, and its stabilization demanded a solution so dangerous that even considering it marked a profound shift in what the Imperium was willing to accept. Here, the Indomitus Crusade's near collapse reached its most revealing phase. Guilliman's earlier compromises, political bargaining, strategic fragmentation, and the abandonment of unified offensives had preserved the Crusade's skeleton, but they had not solved its fundamental vulnerability. The Imperium could not reliably move, supply, or reinforce forces beyond the rift. The galaxy itself had become hostile to Imperial logistics, and no amount of bureaucratic reform or military discipline could change that. Faced with this reality, Guilliman turned to Belisarius Cawl, whose reputation as both savior and heretic had grown steadily throughout the Crusade. Call's proposed solution was as effective as it was terrifying. The application of Necron pylon technology, ancient constructs designed not merely to resist the warp, but to impose order upon it. These devices represented a level of technological mastery the Imperium had never achieved on its own and had long condemned as alien and profane. To rely on them was to acknowledge that humanity's survival now depended on the works of a species it neither understood nor trusted. Wave-like dread intensifies as one considers the implications of this decision. Necron pylons had once stabilized Cadia, holding back the warp through mechanisms rooted in a cold, deterministic logic utterly divorced from human faith. Their use at the Attilan Gate signaled a shift away from the Imperium's spiritual framework toward a future where survival might require the abandonment of long-held theological certainties. For Guilliman, this was not a philosophical choice but a strategic necessity. The Crusade could not advance without a stable corridor, and no Imperial technology could provide it. Yet the cost of this reliance was not merely symbolic. Integrating Necron technology into Imperial infrastructure risked unforeseen consequences, introducing alien principles into systems already strained to breaking. It also deepened the Imperium's dependence on Call, whose understanding of such technology far exceeded that of any other living human. The Crusade's fate, once bound to Guilliman's leadership, now intertwined irrevocably with Call's inscrutable designs. The stabilization of the Attilan Gate did not arrive as a moment of triumph, but as a grim reprieve. The gate held, warp turbulence diminished, and a narrow path into Imperium Nihilus became viable. But this success carried with it a suffocating realization. The Crusade had crossed a threshold from which it could not return. The Imperium had proven willing to compromise its most sacred taboos to avoid collapse, and there was no guarantee that such compromises would remain isolated. Each victory achieved through forbidden means made the next transgression easier, eroding the boundaries that once defined Imperial identity. Soldiers and commanders alike sensed this shift, understanding that the war had entered a phase where survival would demand choices increasingly detached from the doctrines that had sustained the Imperium for millennia. Faith, once the Imperium's unifying force, now competed with pragmatism in ways that unsettled even the most hardened veterans. The psychological impact of the Attilan Gate stabilization rippled through the Crusade. For some, it reignited hope, offering a tangible path forward into the dark Imperium and a chance to reclaim what had been lost. For others, it marked the moment when the Crusade ceased to represent restoration and instead became a controlled descent into an abyss from which return was uncertain. Guilliman himself stood at the center of this tension, burdened by the knowledge that pressing onward meant committing exhausted forces to a realm where reinforcement and retreat were equally uncertain. The Crusade's structure, already fragmented, would be stretched further as fleets ventured beyond the gate, operating at the edge of Imperial reach and beyond the comfort of established supply lines. The Indomitus Crusade had survived collapse, but it had done so by transforming into something harsher, leaner, and far more desperate than its original vision. The deeper horror of this chapter lies in its revelation that the Crusade's survival no longer depended on victory in any traditional sense. It depended on endurance within an environment fundamentally hostile to human dominance. The Attilan Gate was not a doorway to conquest. It was a narrow lifeline, a controlled breach into a region where the Imperium would be forced to fight on terms dictated by chaos, xenos, and fractured reality. Guilliman's decision to proceed was an act of resolve bordering on defiance, yet it carried the unmistakable weight of inevitability. To stop would doom countless worlds already lost beyond the rift. To continue risked dragging the remnants of the Crusade into a war without limits, where even success could not restore what had been broken. As the Crusade prepared to pass through the stabilized gate, the Indomitus Crusade stood balanced between survival and self-erasure, its future bound to technologies it could not fully control and strategies that offered no promise of final victory. The galaxy ahead was darker, more fragmented, and more hostile than anything faced thus far, and the Imperium's willingness to cross forbidden lines hinted at how far it might yet fall in the name of endurance. And so this chapter closes with a question that casts a long shadow over what lies beyond the gate. If the Indomitus Crusade can move forward only by embracing the unthinkable, what will remain of the Imperium's identity when Guilliman leads his forces fully into a realm where compromise is no longer an exception, but the only path left to survival?